I am today's designated Larry. Larry is called away to do a radio interview today for NPR and asked if I could step in and introduce our speakers today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Henry Jenkins, a faculty member here. And Patricia Lange is someone that I've gotten to know over the last 4 or 5 years, first through her work with MacArthur's Digital Media and Learning Initiative, the Digital Youth Project, which did a large-scale ethnography of young people's involvement in new media technologies. And then I was fortunate enough to be a talking head in a documentary that grew out of that project on the video blogging community, which she was nice enough to share with my students in last spring at an early stage of its development. And she's now a visiting scholar in the Department of Anthropology here at USC, and is going to do a talk that's been most anticipated by the members of my research group, and I know a number of others here on campus. Her talk's called Kids on YouTube, Prospects for Civic Engagement. And so I'm going to turn it over to Patricia.
Thanks, Henry. Okay, so the agenda for today is I'm going to quickly situate the origin of the study, talk a little bit about the sociology of childhood and how it applies to the topic of civic engagement. And as we move through the talk, what I want people to kind of keep in mind is how the talk speaks to and extends prior studies of the internet and civic engagement online. And the kinds of topics that have been talked about have to do more with things like time displacement and concerns about people spending too much time online. But studies have shown that actually what happens is the internet tends to become incorporated into people's political repertoires. So if you're an active information gatherer before, then you go to the internet and you're an active information gatherer there. But what I've observed in my research with kids and teens is that increased time online doesn't really tend to diminish social ties. As a matter of fact, I have some case studies that I've been publishing where kids actually bond closer together because they're making videos together for YouTube. So it can actually increase the sociality of in-person interaction. But what the scholars who are looking at the internet and civic engagement say is that what they feel is missing is some kind of understanding of maybe the kinds of behaviors that would be seen as new forms of civic participation. And I certainly hope to start with those kinds of examples and then move to more familiar case studies of civic engagement among kids and youth. So as Henry mentioned, this came out of the very large-scale MacArthur project to try and understand what kids actually do when they go online, because there wasn't really, it was felt, a good understanding. So our project was quite large and had a lot of different sub-projects. My YouTube was one of 23 case studies, for example. And the whole idea was to be able to say, what do kids actually do online, and how can we inform policymakers and designers of software, educational systems, to try and improve their activities. So a number of studies have come out of it, and right now I'm preparing a book-length manuscript called Kids on YouTube, tentatively titled, Technical Identities and Digital Literacies. And so it was an ethnographic study where it was a multi-method study where I talked to a lot of people. I went to meetups across the United States. I myself have a video blog both on YouTube and off called Anthroblog, or Anthropology Video Blog. And so I tried to become a participant in the community myself and see what that felt like to be putting up videos once a week for a year. And what you're going to see today is kind of my thoughts on a book chapter that I'm preparing called Mediated Civic Engagement. And what I want us to keep in mind as I go through the talk is what we're going to see with the sociology of childhood in the next couple of slides is that there tends to be a lot of focus on what kids are going to do in the future, and a lot of how can we prepare them to start doing civic engagement. And what hopefully this talk will get us to see is they're already doing civic engagement. So the question is, what skills do they have, and how can we increase their repertoire? How can their repertoires be expanded? And what do their experiences tell us about the process, the theoretical process of civic engagement? So as I mentioned, the sociology of childhood, one of the things I really want to stress as we're going through this talk is that what they say is that childhood cannot be separated, the concept of childhood, from other variables, such as class and gender and ethnicity. But what I want to make sure we understand, we're on the same page, is that it can be considered apart from technical affiliations and how people identify with certain technologies or find themselves gravitating towards certain values and beliefs that tend to get associated with certain members of technical communities. Those can't be separated, and we're going to see examples of how those kinds of technical affiliations influence young people's civic style, how they decide to engage. So we want to go forward and not just look at in a forward-looking way, but look at what they're actually doing right now. So one of the kind of things that follows along that is that there's obviously a tension in trying to go from protection to individuality and individual choice. And what the scholars of civic engagement argue is that we've gone so far in the direction of protection that we're not even recognizing what kids are doing in terms of civic engagement. So we need to be able to continue protection, but in a way that respects individuality. And what I find so interesting is that we need to, according to these scholars, expand our notions beyond what they call the cherished child or the protected child. This idea that we have to keep them from things like flame wars on YouTube, so they shouldn't engage in that way because they could be hurt. And what I'm hearing in the interviews and what I'm seeing in their visuals, and this is a screenshot from one of the mashups that I'm going to show later, is that people are sensitive about what's happening to kids, happening to people that they know. They're already making media about it. So rather than kind of just assume that there's this protected child notion, we need to kind of move beyond that and see kids more as assets rather than as a problem to be solved. So when scholars sit down and they think about civic engagement, one of the things that they observe is that civic engagement tends to be associated very narrowly with political activities, where you're doing very specific things with institutions or their representatives. But what they argue is we need a much broader understanding of civic engagement, so that we want to include all the kinds of things that they do in their organic, ordinary practices, like volunteering, which is a very important part of kids' civic style today. How do they change their environment? What kind of practices and knowledge are helping in those processes of change? And I'm also going to argue that we even need another category that maybe even goes prior to when they do their volunteering. And this is a category I'm tentatively calling proto-civic engagement. And this is an idea that we're going to be talking about skills and practices that help kids have a more outward focus. What's important in terms of social problems to social groups or collectivities? How do they express themselves? How do they take on ideas of responsibility? And what's very, very important to this concept is Flanagan and Faison's idea of civic attachment. And I find this to be very, very interesting. They talk about how if you're going to be engaged civically, you need some kind of affective or emotional connection to a physical place, to an assembly of people, to a polity. The idea that your voice is going to matter. So in combination with things like what Levine talks about when he talks about developing a public voice, which means any kind of tone or style or any method in which you try to persuade people that are not part of your immediate friends and family. So when you take these things together, you're talking about certain kinds of self-presentation skills, certain acceptance of responsibility, certain attachments to places that these scholars argue are very important even before you talk about what we even recognize maybe as overt civic engagement like volunteering at a soup kitchen and things like that. So to kind of illustrate and flesh out this idea of proto-civic engagement, I'm going to turn to a case study now, the Field family. That's a pseudonym. Mr. Field requested that we use the name Mr. Field to refer to him. And he has two sons, 9 years old and 11 years old. And they're very much a part of the video blogging community outside of YouTube. They're part of a group that I'm kind of referring to in some of my work as first-generation video bloggers, which doesn't necessarily mean that they were the very first to put video on the web, but in 2004 they were kind of figuring out how to do it before there were big services like YouTube. So they're very technically oriented, they're very media savvy. For those of you who are following that community, I'm talking about people like, Jay Dedman and Ryan Hodson and Steve Wolf and Michael Verity and those folks. And they were very much part of this community. Not so much YouTube, although they did post on YouTube. They didn't see that necessarily as their media center of gravity. So in this community, there are very specific technical things that should happen in order to be considered a participant. And one of them was having your own video blog. It's de rigueur to have your own video blog outside of YouTube. So here's an example of performing those kinds of technical affiliations through how you present yourself online. So now I'd like to move to kind of Mr. Field's perspective that he shared in an interview about what his goals were for his children. And I find his remarks incredibly useful for understanding this concept of proto-civic engagement, because he's talking about how he wants his children to be aware of the world around him. So the kids are being pulled into that sort of other-centric focus. And he sort of says, I don't really think they can, comprehend the magnitude, but I want them to start getting that feeling of understanding that governments have objectives, they can influence people, and how are they going to be able to do that themselves in their own media. So I loved his remark. I just really want them to be actors in the sense of the world stage. So contrary to a lot of the stereotypes about all kids wanting to be movie stars on YouTube, what we see here is a person who's very steeped in media technically and wanting his kids to have that kind of self-expression and participate on the world stage. So when we look at some of the snapshots there from their video blog, we see all the different kinds of skills that help illustrate proto-civic engagement. So we see the idea of confronting the camera, being able to deal with the camera and being able to speak to the camera and get your own point of view across in a mediated way. You see examples of how they are often going to festivals, local festivals in their community, constantly trying to reach out and figure out what's happening in their immediate community. And that sort of stimulates this idea of civic attachment, a place you care about, you have affective ties to. You see them interviewing, like you see them interviewing their grandmother, about their Thanksgiving experiences, but you also see them learn how to interview folks who help out with environmentally friendly bus systems in their local community. So these interviewing skills, which Howard Rheingold says is incredibly important for developing a public voice, is being illustrated in their video blog. And in the upper left there, you see them going door to door because they decided to have a leaf breaking business. So they start going door to door to persuade people to participate in their business and pay them to make the community a little bit better through their leaf breaking. So here, these are all sets of skills that we may or may not quite see as traditional civic engagement, but they bring people into those affective ties. So what I'd like to do now is show you just a little clip of one of their video blogs. One of the things they like to talk about is the weather, so they're often showing images of the weather. And in this particular clip, they're telling you that they're going to be making a weather vane or a wind vane.
So we told you we were going to make a new weather instrument. And here it is, a wind vane.
A weather vane is an instrument that measures the direction of the wind. Usually wind from the south is warm and wind from the north is cool. We used a plastic sheet to make the tail and head of the vane. There was a lot of measuring and cutting. We used a knife, ruler, and pencil to make the tail. We got it down straight to the basic body of the wind vane.
Okay, so you can see that the way they choose to express themselves through media is very related to their technical affiliation to the video blogging community in which they're a part. So the notion of technical affiliation that I talk about means displaying these kinds of alliances to beliefs and practices that are associated with particular technical groups. And in this case, there are definite associations with how you should present yourself in a video blog. First of all, you should have your own blog outside of YouTube and follow certain kinds of ways of pulling people in and providing continuity and consistency across your different episodes. So they always open with introductions. Welcome to our show. I'm Bob. I'm John. And then they have continuity from the last episode. They are always providing links about the places they're going to and the things they're learning about. And they're constantly posting. And they try to kind of encourage participation by saying, well, what was your weather like? Why don't you email me? So these are all ways that they're trying to learn the basic skills of participating and expressing themselves online. So many of the things, as we talked about, that are very important to civic engagement are happening in their video blog. They're developing that outward focus and that their affinity for their local place. But what I find very interesting about the sample we just saw is that one of the things you want to kind of make people understand is that when you want to persuade somebody of an issue, you need to collect information. And if you're talking about an issue in your local place, you need to collect information about your local place. And so what we saw in that last clip there was that they were learning how to build instruments to take measurements of the weather in their own environment. So again, proto-civic engagement is not necessarily something where they're directly finding information about a political issue, but they're kind of developing through the idea that if you want to understand your environment, you're going to have to collect information about it. So the next case study is Wendy. She's 16 and she considers herself very technical. She volunteers with an organization in New York City that tries to help their communities build social capital by talking about the needs of their local neighborhoods and figuring out ways to address those problems. So she decided to make a documentary, and this is much more what we would recognize as civic engagement a little bit more directly. Because here, what had happened was Sarah Roosevelt Park, which is that picture in the middle, the blue structure, was run down and kind of dilapidated. So it was put on the agenda to improve this park. And so she decided to go out to different parks and witness what was going on at these parks, and then talk about them in her documentary, and then eventually interview people, as you see on the bottom left there, about what their vision was, what their dreams were for a local park, and then put this in a video that then could sort of give more information about how the park could be improved. Oh, so what I'm going to do now is show a little clip of her interviewing one of the local participants about what they envision the park should look like.
Hello, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions. You're around the community or?
Yes, I live in this community about almost 30 years.
30 years, that's great. You know that the SDR is getting constructed. What do you expect for the playground to look like?
For it to look like and be something that the neighborhood can really use, and that the neighborhood feels like it's got some impact on deciding what goes in here, what it ends up looking like. So I'm wide open. I love to see a lot of things, but mostly I think it has to reflect the neighborhood and what people here want to see.
Well, have you walked around this playground?
Yes.
Do you notice anything missing?
No. Sometimes what I notice is just that it's very deteriorated. It's in bad condition, and the playground equipment, it looks like the young people don't get to use it as much because I think the parents don't feel like it's very safe, especially for the younger kids. So I think that if the playground equipment was upgraded and updated, and I mean, a lot of ideas come to mind. You know, the sky's the limit. It'd be interesting to see things that reflect the culture of the neighborhood.
Okay, so what kinds of skills and contributions is Wendy offering? Well, she obviously picks a topic that is very vital to their neighborhood. The park is dilapidated. It's very important for children to have a space of play, and so she's interviewing folks about their dreams and their goals. And she shows some very important interviewing skills. She establishes the authority of the interviewee. You know, are you a resident here? Yes, I've been here for 30 years. When this person has the authority to speak about what they would want their park to be, she displays a kind of rapport. You know, we're going to ask you some questions now. So she's already having a lot of very important skills, and she's an active agent of change for her neighborhood. In addition, she has a great use of different kinds of visual literacies because she's using different camera angles and pans to portray the different spaces of the park, and then be able to juxtapose people's comments with illustrations of what a great park might look like. So again, we're not talking about giving her skills, we're talking about expanding on a skill set where she's an agent of change. Now, Snow and Benford have some really interesting ideas about what should happen in terms of successful civic engagement. And one of the things they talk about is sort of the triad there of diagnosis, prognosis, and motivation. So we can kind of run Wendy's work through this lens and say, how well did she do on diagnosis? Well, she did pretty well. I mean, she went through and she witnessed these different parts, and we can go ahead and use that term in the way Peters used it, which means knowing that you're on the side of right, you're trying to make some improvements, and you're accepting the responsibility to share what you know. And so she makes that diagnosis about the problems, and she offers prognosis about specific strategies and tactics. In her film, she talks about whether or not there should be, tire swings or swings, or, she gives specific examples of how to make the park better. And then she does use motivators to get people to change their behavior. So you see here with directives, like it's your turn to speak out. What kind of park do you want? She's trying to bring people in to this notion of being able to speak about what they think is important for their space. So if we take some of these things that we've already been looking at and kind of bring them all together, we have this notion of more reticulated civic engagement, which can be thought of as more of a combination of actions and knowledge and media and participation that draw people in to participate and create a change or address a social problem. And we're going to see these examples of reticulated civic engagement throughout the rest of the talk. So here's another example, Max. He's 14, He's been fairly successful. He's probably the most successful in terms of viewership in the case studies presented today. He says one of his videos was featured on Good Morning America. He has his own production company and logo. And when I was interviewing him, I asked him, why do you have a logo? And he said, well, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas have a logo, and I want to be a professional, so I have a logo. So he's thinking about the future, and he knows how people brand themselves and market themselves, and he wants to make sure that that's how he's perceived. I think what's interesting about Max, and actually every person in this case study, is that when I went to do this ethnographic project, I didn't necessarily want to know only about their civic engagement. What I went in with was a very broad sort of lens. Hey, what kind of videos are they making? And what I found so interesting was that in most cases, they were interested in a huge variety of things. Sometimes, sitcoms, sometimes comedy shows, or more video blogging, naturalistic spaces. But they all had maybe one video in their book where they were talking about civic engagement, and clearly they had been thinking about some issues that popped up on the radar. So it's very interesting that they are engaging in a kind of organic way, even if maybe that's not the whole, center of gravity for their whole work. So we're going to see a remix video that Max did about images from Palestine that disturbed him, which he matched up with music from Schindler's List, which is a film about the Jewish Holocaust. And we're going to see how he decided to juxtapose ideas in terms of the brutality that has been observed and recorded, and how that can provoke people into thinking about making a change. So in an interview, when I asked him about this film, he said that it was close to him because he had a lot of friends and neighbors who are Palestinian, and that, he was concerned about them and concerned about their well-being. So he felt affected by this, and he wanted to do something about it. What could he do? Well, he felt he could make media about it and express his opinion. So he and his cousin searched all through Google to look for images, and he found them together and felt that this particular juxtaposition was useful for raising awareness about brutalities in the Middle East. So let's take a look at just a snippet of his mashup and remix. Okay, so there's been a lot of reaction to Max's video, and there's just so much to flag. But I wanted to at least point out that there were different categories of reaction to his work. One of them was obviously showing support for one side or another. And so people had very strong reactions and wanted to weigh in on their feelings. So that was one category of reaction. Another category of reaction had to do with media. And it was a very interesting discussion about what media should accomplish in a civic engagement kind of space. For example, the comment, well, there are two sides to every story. I just think that's such an interesting turn of phrase, two sides. I mean, if you look at Deborah Tannen's work on the argument culture from 1998, she argues that we're so obsessed with this idea of two sides that we lose track of the fact that, there could be many sides to a story, right? There could be 30 sides to the story. But we have this obsession with kind of gravitating toward this polarized two sides. And what does it mean to sort of buy into that, an idea in terms of what kind of media coverage you should have? Maybe you shouldn't worry about another side. Maybe if personally this is a story that hasn't been told very much, maybe you should tell that. Whether or not you're trying to be representative of all the sides, in an impartial way, maybe this is the time for you to speak and talk about things that are important to you. So then Max gets into a kind of a little discussion there with somebody saying, I have a right to express my opinion. And he says, I want to express my opinion too. And if I didn't want anyone's opinion, I would have disabled comments. So he, like many of the kids and youth that I interviewed, explicitly talked about their support of free speech by leaving comments on their page, even if they violently disagreed with them or they even found them offensive. they felt that it was very important to have a statement and leave those comments on the page to show that they did support free speech, even if it was sometimes painful to hear some of the comments. And then it also, we're not going to go through all this, but just to give you the sense here, it also prompted some discussion about actual political policies and the effects on children. Some people say maybe we should have more interventionist policies, maybe we shouldn't. But the point here is this is a whole other category of information that was generated. And I love this quote very much because it sort of kind of congratulates him for using media in a particular way to be able to encourage the discussion of conflict or problems, differences of opinion. So he had, or whoever posted this, kind of, I think, in a capsule, encourages this kind of diversity. So there's a lot of concern about things like flaming and meaningful discourse and polarization on YouTube, and these are all very valid concerns. But what I would like us to also think about is that obviously, first of all, things like flaming and things like argument are they vary culturally, contextually. And so people have different tolerance levels for different types of arguing. And we need to keep that in mind as we look at the actual work that some of these comments are doing. Sometimes it does articulate less understood viewpoints, or it does bring greater salience to the idea of mediated witnessing and being able to show images from a place where it's difficult to get pictures out. And it does sort of show a kind of coalition building dynamic when people come out with these very strong statements. And one of the things that I find very interesting too is that when Max says, I want to leave these opinions on here because I think it supports free speech, he's taking a metapragmatic stance with regards to how people should participate on YouTube. And metapragmatic in this case meaning language about language, normative language about how language should be used. And in this case, his metapragmatic stance is that they should be kept on YouTube, even if there's some clashing and diversity. And what scholars of civic engagement argue is that at this point, in their opinion, from some of the studies they've done in the US and the UK, the civics in the schools are just so watered down, and the textbooks are just very safe, stereotypical subjects, where there doesn't seem to be any conflict. It was just a done deal, right? The Declaration of Independence. So what that does, these scholars argue, is that it kind of reduces people's sense of obligation, because if these things were just meant to be, and they were always meant to be, and it always happened, then I guess there's really nothing for them to do. It'll all just work itself out. And what they argue is that they observe time and time again that the classroom dynamics tended to shy away from any kind of controversy. And so other studies are saying, kids want this information, even though we have this protectionist sort of idea to the point where it gets very difficult to just really understand and discuss things that are contentious. And maybe that's a good thing, to be able to have people move through the space of dealing with contentious issues, both in the classroom and online. So there's a quote from Amelia, who's 19. I always kind of, in my interviews, I like to end with a sort of what was the best thing about YouTube, what was the worst thing about YouTube. And she said, well, one of the best things about YouTube was that she could say whatever she wanted, because YouTube was able to open doors for her that she didn't feel she could have in regular conversation with people in the United States, that people should shy away from religion and politics, and so YouTube was a space where you could express your opinion, and she thought that was beautiful, something we needed more of. And YouTube offered a space for that on some level. So obviously one of the things that scholars of civic engagement talk about is the idea that we need to keep open this tolerance and this diversity if you're going to have a democracy. And I personally think that sometimes there's an over-reliance on what the productivity of immediate comments should be. That somehow we have to have this very wise discourse posted to a video. And I think that's a noble goal, but I think there's other things to think about. I think that those comments can be touch points, they can be discussion points in a classroom, where you start looking at the comments and having the kids say, well, what do you think about this comment? What do you think about that comment? Do you think that was effective rhetorically? Do you think this is a good way to express yourself online? And just having these open conversations, which hopefully will then be a circle that has people thinking about how they're posting online. And so hopefully that would be a trajectory that would be improved. But the idea is that you need that kind of reflection. It's not just the participation or throwing out your comment, but reflecting on it and figuring out what did it mean in the larger picture of your mediated civic engagement. So our last case study is on net neutrality from Frank, who's a 15-year-old from the Midwest, and he too was an early adopter of YouTube. The time that I was in the study, 2006. YouTube was really not that old. It was really about 6 months old. So I was talking to a lot of early adopters and more on the technical side. But again, his center of gravity, if you will, with media was not necessarily only civic engagement. He had lots of other things he liked to do. But he felt very passionate about network neutrality, of course, being the idea that there should be non-discriminatory policies offered to people who participate on the internet. So his method of participating and trying to share his strong views about supporting network neutrality emerged in a video blog where he basically just sits at the camera, doesn't even worry about the background, just direct address to the camera and says, you really need to think about, about this net neutrality issue. And what's so compelling in a lot of ways about this, even though one might argue his production values are low or whatever, is that he's trying to get his peers involved through media. He's trying to say, look at these videos on net neutrality. They're very important. It matters in terms of how we're going to be able to communicate in the future. And what scholars of civic engagement say is that oftentimes people don't get involved because they're just not asked. And so he performs an active civic engagement benefit by saying, we need to think about this and do something about it. So like I mentioned, he basically just sits in his video blog and he provides links to other information. He says, let's get that number up for this video that he thinks is the best net neutrality video he's seen. He motivates people and says, go watch this because it's very, very important. It's about Congress passing legislation that's going to change the way you participate. And then he ends up there by saying, so this could be the death of the internet as we know it. So he's very, very concerned about this. And he goes further, and notice his sentence constructor there in the beginning in the discourse. He says, we don't want the internet. So he's, again, outwardly focused, trying to pull in that collectivity. It's not just himself. It's we don't want this. We don't want this to be a one-directional thing controlled by corporations. And he starts naming names. If you look at CNN and Fox News, they don't really give me a good perspective. So I prefer independent news sources. So he starts naming names of brands that he thinks can offer maybe a better perspective than some of the corporate, news sites that he's used to. So, in a way, remember we talked about the metapragmatic experience of Max. We said that when he says something on his blog that says something to the effect of, I really want to keep these comments because it's important to stimulate opinions and not close people down. We said that was metapragmatic because it was language about language. Now what about Frank, who sits and faces the camera and says, I think we should have an internet where I can say my opinion, whatever it is, in the style to which I would like to. We would call this metaphenomenological. If we think of something that's phenomenological as experiential, as something that has to do with how you experience things and how you make meaning out of things, we could say that what Frank is doing is he's having an experience directly facing the camera in a very simple way that normatively says this should be an experience I should be able to have, so that we have a metaphenomenological mediated experience, what media should look like experientially, and I am demonstrating this to you right now through my choice of media. So in doing this, he says he's making this available to all, regardless of things like what their point of view is or their content or their production values. So now we've looked at a range of things. We've looked at proto-civic engagement and how we can talk about reticulated civic engagement, and we can talk about different meta ways of using media. And what I'd like to do is maybe just run a video. I actually didn't speak to these two guys. They say they're 21 on their webpage. I don't know, again, I don't have the personal contact. But I thought their video was very interesting. And I'd like to maybe throw that up and see if we can see some of the things that we've seen throughout the other case studies. But before I do that, I just want to mention one more thing that I think Frank was doing in his video, which I think I've already alluded to, which was the idea that when corporations become so powerful, Scammell argues that you can't ignore the idea how the act of consumption is just so suffused with citizenship characteristics, that you need to be able to hold companies accountable for their behavior, and naming and shaming them. And she argues that this is absolutely fundamental to citizenship in the age of corporate globalization. So we saw that Frank did that by saying, BBC News maybe has a better perspective on U.S., whereas these other news sources, maybe they're more biased, more corporate. So now what I'd like to do is play this video, and I'd like to take in this world of concepts and just sort of evaluate it. We just kind of evaluate it in your head, and if we want to, we can go back during the Q&A and we can come back to it. But I just want you to sort of get a feel for when you encounter something new, what can we say about its prospects for civic engagement?
Everyone, you only know something. Your freedom is at risk. Not your freedom of speech, not your freedom of press, it's your freedom on the internet. What you see, what you do, decided by many cities. Many cities will use what you do because it's many cities. If you know more than they don't pasteurize it, they don't support neutrality. They want to do us fast, they want to do us slow. We can't just stand here and let that go, cause the companies just want more money in their pockets and take away your favorite start to lose your daily comment. Who do you want to control? The company? You. Yo, everyone, what you do and what you do should be up to you. What you see, what you do, will all be decided by bathing suits. The bathing suits will choose what you do. The bathing suits will decide for you. What you see and what you do will all be decided by bathing suits. The bathing suits will choose what you do. The bathing suits will decide for you. Yo, interdicted to stay neutral. Listeners like us can get back to home work after a quick graphic. Let's get real. We suck at it. Yeah, boy.
Okay, so there's a lot going on there that we could kind of evaluate in terms of what we've been talking about for a while now. But I just wanted to end on a couple of things. I wanted to talk a little bit about some future projects that I see coming out of this research, and then some conclusions. Personally, I'm very fascinated with that idea of civic attachment that Flanagan and Faison talk about. And as a matter of fact, I was an invited curator for Pixelodian, which was the first video blogging festival at the American Film Institute. And when I sat down to put together my session, one of the things I noticed was how many videos there were about place. And you would think that, in the age of the internet, why would place be so important? But there were floods and floods of people video blogging about not only place, but like micro places, like their closet or their front stoop. I was fascinated by this, and so I did a whole panel on and curated this whole group of videos about these micro places, which, if you think about it, dovetails with what Howard Rheingold has called hyper-local journalism, Rheingold 2008. And I personally would like to see some of my research going in the direction of looking at how people form these place-based affinities and how they represent them through media. I can also see other projects coming out of this that are more longitudinal. I mean, this particular project was a snapshot in time. And I think ideally you would have a more longitudinal study that looked at the civic style of different subsequent generations and looked at what were successful civic habits in each of those generations, or maybe even just came back like 6 months later, 2 years later. Even that amount of time in a teen's life, goes from 16 to 18, goes from 18 to 20, to 20. I think even if you could come back with some periodic discussions, I think that would be very, very fruitful for understanding just how media played a role in their civic engagement. I also think looking at the different media choices and what was successful there, and also can we do like a comparative generic focus and say, were there certain genres that seemed to jump out at people more? I mean, the last one we saw how they used the genre of the music video to portray in a playful way their political ideas. But it would be interesting to have a larger project that really systematically looked at different genres, in my opinion. So how can we conclude from all this material? Well, kids already possess important skills who are making videos. So the question is, how can they be used as assets, if you will, or agents of change, rather than just a problem, a liability, something for the future where they're taught civics for later? And how can you expand those repertoires? So I think if we put our heads together and we looked at all this media, we could probably come up with a lot of different ideas. about how to assist each individual in expanding their repertoire while still respecting what they did bring to the table in terms of their talents and skills. We do need models of articulated civic engagement that do go on and offline, that do go across time, that answer the big questions for people in civic engagement, which is how to move people from not interested at all to interested, and how to move people from interested to active. Right now, the civic style of kids today, according to these civic engagement scholars, is a very one-on-one sort of style. They associate volunteering in a soup kitchen, with politics. And that's great on one level, but you need to get, to another point where there's maybe more interaction on the political side, a larger conception of a collective problem rather than it's great to help one person, but then how can we connect this to a larger collectivity? And try to figure out what are the challenges that block the reticulated civic engagement at particular points. So, again, I'm always going to be looking at this through my lens of technical affiliation performances. And, hearing Frank say, I asked him, look, do you tell your friends about this in school, about network neutrality? And he says, well, yeah, sort of, but they're not geeks. They don't really spend any time online. So they're just totally not interested. So this is a potential blockage, right, that they just don't have the investment in the internet as a place, as a space to interact. So these are examples of the kinds of challenges we need to examine and overcome. And we need to have a much more expanded idea of civic engagement and participatory literacy through media that include different ways that people develop their public voice and respect not only kids' protection, but also the playful way that they choose to engage civically and allow themselves as kids, as youth, to have a persuasive character and participate in civic affairs. And that's it. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions. Yes, over there.
I am fascinated by the case study of yours. It's really good. So I just have a quick question about these kids that you studied. It seems to me they are sort of very active. I mean, there are a lot of kids. I mean, we talk about a generation of kids growing up with YouTube. Do you have any idea how representative these kids are? And also, in terms of, so first of all, if there are stars, and if there are representatives, there are many other kids doing the same thing, that's great. On the other hand, we only have a small set of stars, and how much of their star power, so to speak, can influence their peers, and can you say more about it?
Right. Well, I think you bring up a really good point. These are leading edge users, and I know that a lot of the discussion, in the paper and magazines, talk about how there's, like everybody can just post on YouTube, but it was not my experience that all teens were posting on YouTube. There were some people who had much greater commitment to video or to YouTube. So, those were two different things. And you're right to point out that they may not be representative of other people. There's a couple of ways to think about that. One is the idea that there, as you said, just because there may not be on YouTube doesn't mean that there aren't activities going on that we can't see. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Reingold talks about when he talks about trying to have classroom activities in which people try out their hand at different kinds of mediated ways to persuade other people. So whether or not they're representative, and our guess is probably not, because that would require a larger, expansive study. But even if they aren't, it's important to try and encourage those activities in the classroom. So I co-authored a book, for example, called Teaching Tech-Savvy Kids. I co-authored a chapter in the book about YouTube, and there was all kinds of ideas and exercises for how to pull people in to do this, even though they may not want to have such a public presence on YouTube. And then the second response I would make to that is something I was talking about earlier, which has to do with, whether or not they can persuade their immediate circle. And maybe in some cases they can, because their friends aren't geeks. They can, it's publicly available, and so it's a great teaching tool to be able to find these things and go on YouTube and pull them into the classroom. And they can find maybe a voice where they connect with peers in other ways, even if in that particular case, they may not be able to do it locally. There's still a whole lot of possibility when they can publish online that easily.
Over here.
Do you see any sort of conflict between children who are too young themselves to be the ones posting on YouTube, whose parents kind of have taken the agency themselves to represent their children digitally, and kind of the point at which children then have the technological ability or cognitive ability to be able to process these things on YouTube? Do you see these things kind of in conflict with parents and kids, and the way that parents and kids intergenerationally relate to YouTube together or separately?
Right. Well, I think you bring up a good point, and I think it's always a negotiation, you know, how out there different parents want to be. And I've met some parents that are very, very gung-ho, and their kids are not so gung-ho. So when the parent's saying, hey, let's video blog again, you know, the kid's like, oh God, you know, please turn that camera off. So it is a negotiation, and there can be tensions. But on the other hand, like when I look at the Field family, for example, and maybe the boys are sort of encouraged to participate more, but in a gentle way, so that they're able to experiment with their persona and experiment with what it means to participate. I think these are all part of digital literacies. And when we talk about digital literacies, we almost always are talking about kids, you know, and how they're learning to express themselves. But I think another part of it is, you know, learning to negotiate and understand what your kid's perspective is. Maybe they don't want to be as public as you do. And having that conversation and those skills, I think that's important. I think it's negotiable. I think it's part of digital literacies. So there's not really one hard and fast solution. I grew up in a household where I hated having my picture taken. I never put my face in any of my video blogs. So people have different dispositions. And I think that gets lost a lot of times in the discussion about digital use. That they're all on the same page with regard to these technologies. But people have different dispositions with regards to media. So I think hopefully you bring up a point that will be discussed more in terms of educating parents as well about where the lines should be drawn.
Okay, Tosh, and then
I wanted to ask you, what were some of the differences, I guess, in terms of class among the the young people who you interviewed in case studies? And then additionally, what are your thoughts, I guess, in relation to digital literacy and kind of questions of inequality? I'm just thinking specifically like libraries closing, especially in like Los Angeles, as well as inequality within education in terms of having access to the tools of production in order to kind of learn how to utilize.
Yeah, I mean, those are really good questions. In terms of class, again, it's a small-scale study, so it's really hard to make large-scale, you know, discussions of what the world of YouTube looks like. But on the one hand, I felt like I did talk to a lot of kids who were not necessarily very privileged. And actually, that could make a whole other study, is looking at their workarounds when they wanted to get their video up, that something was broken or something, and then they would have friends help them get the video up on YouTube. And so they didn't necessarily have the latest or greatest cameras, you know, to do things. But I did see people able to participate on some level, even though the background they talk about in terms of their family background did not, it sounded very modest. You know, they always ask, what do your parents do for a living? And we kind of got a lot of examples of where people were not, you know, were living in a modest way, but they were able to participate. On the other hand, we wouldn't want to overgeneralize that too much, because a lot of times there was another side to the story. You know, we have 5 computers in our home, and you know, my mother, my father, you know, works for a marketing company, and so there was a lot of resources within the home, not just in terms of the physical stuff, but just in terms of how do you do media and how do you represent yourself, that I saw quite often. I mean, the Field family is a very good example, where the father is very active in the video blogging community. He did, you know, the business development for media companies. I mean, so he had a lot of background on that, and he was able to have, you know, help his kids think about those issues. So I think if we really wanted to address class across YouTube, we really have to have one of those, you know, wider studies. And it could be difficult to pinpoint, but I did see kind of a mixed bag. I saw some people able to participate, but I did see a kind of a gap in the sense that there certainly were kids that were more prepared. And as far as your other question, I mean, that's kind of a very important question. We need to go out and figure out what the kind of infrastructures look like in schools. This happens to be an online project, but I do see, in a sense, that kind of digital divide in terms of physical access being perpetuated on some level. You know, people aren't doing this in their libraries because you need the connection. You know, you need a certain set of basic technologies to be able to throw together some media. So unfortunately, that I still observe that.
Kevin?
Today there's a lot of people on YouTube who self-identify as YouTubers, and many of them have a profit-sharing relationship with Google. And YouTube is an important advertising platform for Google. And it was interesting that the Field family seemed to have a little bit of a hierarchy in place about videos that are on YouTube versus using their own platform. Did you have conversations with people who had ambitions toward that profit-sharing situation, or had thought of making videos as a way of making money?
I did. That conversation tended to not be so much about civic engagement, per se, but I did talk to people. And the thing about YouTube is that there's a lot of variety, and some people who wanted to enjoy the profit-sharing aspect also wanted to make friends So sometimes these things were very intertwined, and sometimes not so much. Sometimes they just used the social networks, and they knew what they were doing. They were using the social networks in order to make, more visibility for their work and then be able to enjoy the profit sharing for whatever that's worth. I mean, talk about a two-tiered group. I mean, there's some people who seem to benefit quite a bit, claiming they made thousands of dollars a month, and other people who would say in their videos, well, I made $50 this month, and I'm going to just give it back to the community by telling you guys, giving you guys a video that you asked for. So, it just ran the gamut of people who just wanted to do socially and other people who wanted to be professional, and then those in-between areas where people wanted to be professional, but they also wanted to have friends. But yeah, those conversations didn't tend to drift toward their ideas about civic engagement necessarily. They tended to focus more on, how they were able to use maybe more social techniques to get better visibility for their work. But you could use that idea in terms of civic engagement. I mean, I have this piece out called Videos of Affiliation, and videos of Affinity. And the idea is that you could maybe use ideas of social affinity to establish these reticulated networks of civic engagement. So that's a possibility, to use those techniques to increase visibility, but maybe not necessarily participate in profit sharing. I mean, maybe or maybe not.
Okay, well, over here is next. I'm going to have to slide out and see moderation, so gotta go teach.
My question is about ethnicity. So in the first two studies, John, Bob, and Wendy, they're all Asian Americans, and then Frank is white male from East Coast, and I want to see if you see other kids of other ethnicities, like African Americans, Latinos, whether they show the same commitment to YouTube, or whether they choose other forms of civic engagement to express their views.
Right. Well, that's a good question, and I do recall interviewing a woman who was black, but the thing about it is that our project was skewed towards kids, and so although I've seen a lot of black folk as adults on YouTube, I've seen fewer as kids. So one of the things that I think would be interesting for a future study is to try and figure out, basically, if there are consistent patterns racially. I did seem to notice a pattern in terms of gender, which was that when you're trying to seek out like somebody to interview, the guys seem to be much more public with their persona. I'm a 14-year-old male, here's my picture in my video. They seem to be much more outward. Whereas girls from the US seem to be different than girls from other English-speaking countries, like like England or Canada or Australia. If my task had been just interview girls around the world, it seems to me that would have been a lot easier. But I get the feeling that just my kind of qualitative instinct was that girls from the U.S. tended to have more protection concerns and tend to put themselves out there less. So I always think this would be such a great next study, because is it true that girls from the U.S. are being trained in a different way to express themselves publicly? Because my task would have been a lot easier if I didn't have to have that U.S. restriction for girls, not for boys, but for girls. And I didn't see necessarily. And the thing for me is I don't study personally race or social race or ethnicity per se as an anthropologist. And visually, I always find that difficult because people self-identify in all different kinds of ways. So I find it difficult in some ways to kind of scope out and find people that I know for sure would be identified as X, Y, or Z. So I find that to be a kind of a methodological problem, but still an interesting question.
So you mentioned displacement thinking at the beginning, so I was kind of old hat. I kind of want to return to it a little bit,
Sure.
in the sense that if these kids are doing this, they're not doing something else, maybe for better or worse, depending on what the other thing was. But also, how does what they're doing affect their more close at home and in school social networks? I didn't hear anything about feedback or backlash, and so some of the videos I saw, I could imagine kids being carried on people's shoulders through the hallways or stuffed into trash cans and anything in between.
Right.
How are these practices fitting in their daily life? And I'm going to make this kind of unfair. I shared the same comments my first two colleagues did with the sense of generalizability in the sampling, and that I'm not sure how could you. I'm not even sure how you could answer my question unless you sort of do exactly the census of all the kids.
Exactly. I mean, questions like, what does the world of ethnicity look like on YouTube? Or What is the world of, time displacement on YouTube? These are questions that are interesting, but they need a quantitative, large-scale sample to really seriously address, in a wide way. But that doesn't mean we don't have some insights and window into some of the things that were going on.
I'm giving you license to anecdote now.
Well, basically, like I say, it was an ethnographic project, and I think what it does do is it helps understand, in terms of feedback, you have to kind of understand that despite the rhetoric, that this digital youth rhetoric that everybody's online, it's not the case. There's a lot of diversity, and there's a lot of, as I said, different commitments to the videos and to posting online. So kids didn't always have an easy time kind of sharing their video experiences with their peers. That is why they were on YouTube. And that is why they were so happy to get feedback from all over the world, because they weren't getting that kind of feedback in the classrooms. And I did not study classrooms, but the civic engagement scholars who do claim that there's a lot of shying away in US and UK culture from doing anything too controversial in the classroom. So what this kind of study tries to do is to say there's an alternative, which is you can post online, you can reflectively talk about these things in the classroom, and be able to start these conversations. It's kind of jump-starting in some areas because there's no feedback because they're shying away from these kinds of things in classrooms. So it's kind of a chicken and egg sort of thing. If you're not providing this in classrooms, people aren't going to give you the right kind of feedback to then improve. So the idea is to break that cycle with qualitative small-scale studies like this by showing you examples of what might happen.
And with that, I'm very sorry. I'm taking over for Henry, taking over for Larry. It's left to me, which tells you what's going on elsewhere. So we want to thank Patricia very much for being with us today.